Bubbles have almost always preceded some important technological shift.
Hello. Welcome to the Term Sheet Podcast. I'm Allie Garfinkel, senior writer here at Fortune. And every week on the Term Sheet Podcast, we go over the latest deals, news, and insights in venture capital, private equity, and startups. Every week, this is where you can hear from some of the most exciting figures in the private markets. It's a big OpenAI news week for more reasons than one. The company announced a data infrastructure partnership with chipmaker AMD that's worth billions of dollars and sent shares of AMD skyrocketing in the aftermath. Almost simultaneously, the company unveiled a new range of product announcements around coding, agents, apps, and an API update, all structured towards two things: integration with partners like Canva or Zillow, and simplicity, the idea that anybody, including me, could say make an agent. And of course, a few days ago, the company also launched its video model, Sora 2. Now, speaking of OpenAI, on to this week's guest. Now, this week's guest is a surprise guest. This was a last-minute opportunity. I got on a plane to come to San Francisco early just to see him. This week, we have OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap. Now, Brad is among OpenAI's earliest hires who wasn't on the research side. Brad knows Sam Altman from Y Combinator. He has been with the company through almost every step of its meteoric rise. Now, OpenAI has about 800 million weekly active users on the consumer side. But there is a sense that in order to truly succeed down the line, the company must also win on the enterprise AI side. And Brad is the guy tasked with making that happen. Brad and I sat down to talk about the past, present, and future of enterprise AI and startups. Here's Brad.
Brad Lightcap, welcome to the Term Sheet Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
There are a couple firsts here. I'm at my first OpenAI DevDay. This is our first live recording in front of an audience. This is the first time I've sat in this gaming chair, not in my apartment. So we're firing on all cylinders right now. Brad, you were telling me a funny story before this started. So let's go there. What was the funny story?
Well, so the prompt originally was, I think, what was the craziest thing you've ever asked ChatGPT?
Yes, our audience asked.
And I couldn't come up with an answer fast enough, but I do remember this one thing that someone told me at a very large enterprise that shall remain nameless. There's a very senior executive at this enterprise who, this is early on, he was like probably the first really true early enterprise adopter of ChatGPT that we encountered. And he had to give a speech in front of the entire company. And he thought it would be funny if he gave the entire speech in the style of Dr. Seuss. And so he wrote an entire speech for a large institution that he gave
How long was the speech?
Long, it was like addressing the company at their annual meeting, and he gave the entire speech in the style of Dr. Seuss, and he was like, I thought it was hilarious, and everyone else eventually thought it was hilarious, and I thought that was great.
Everyone else eventually thought it was hilarious?
I think there was confusion at first.
There was initial confusion.
This was before ChatGPT was the thing it is now, so a lot of people had no idea how or why I think he had done this, but he just thought it was great.
Oh, so it was the sort of thing people were like, how did he do this? Why did he do this?
Yes.
I'm sure we'll talk about many other enterprise use cases, but let's start with DevDay here, because implicitly what we're talking about here is enterprise, right? Let's start with Dr. Seuss, why not? But what's true today that wasn't true at the last DevDay?
I would say the biggest things are the models have just gotten significantly better. And I think there's a whole lot of product engineering around the models now. There's all this kind of scaffolding and infrastructure that's been built, which is great, and I think all that stuff is important. But I think what somewhat gets lost is just the fact that every turn of the crank of the models just completely expands the aperture for the types of things that you can do and you can build. And so DevDay for me is always this kind of cool annual check-in of what types of things are possible now that weren't possible a year ago. And for me, those are things that are very emblematic of what you've seen here today. So Agent Kit is a great example of you now have ways to very dependably and reliably kind of build and construct agents for really any kind of arbitrary task that can kind of be encoded in a set of steps in a workflow on a computer. And what do you need for that to be true? You need models that have kind of a generalizable reasoning ability to be able to think through a problem. They need to be able to call tools. They need to be able to correct their own mistakes. They need to be able to use the web, write code. There needs to be kind of a mix of their kind of almost stochastic nature with kind of the way that you kind of imbued a little bit of determinism into the business process. And so that enables something like Agent Kit to get built. And I think if you tried to build that, even a year ago, like I don't know that it would have been possible. I mean, people forget like O3, I think we came out with in December of last year. So not even a year ago. And now you've got models like GPT-5 that enable that type of thing to get built. So that's what's exciting for me. And I suspect next year we'll see something else amazing.
Yeah, to that end, there's been a lot of news today, including the AMD deal. Why announce the AMD deal today in addition to all of these other product announcements?
I don't make the comms decisions, but I think for us, like the infrastructure component of this is almost in some sense becoming as important as the core research. And the two go hand in hand, obviously. And so there's almost maybe something, I guess, kind of poetic about there being both of these things getting announced at the same time. One, this gigantic investment on the infrastructure side that we intend to make, among many others. And then, here on the other hand, this kind of this way that we can talk about the platforms that we're building and the things that every developer in this room and many, many millions around the world can build. And this kind of almost supply and demand a little bit like real time happening today. And I think that's cool. So I didn't plan it that way. This is a little bit of like ex post, revisionism, but I thought it was it's a cool juxtaposition of like, we want to invest in exactly this. And this is the afternoon in some sense is a reminder of why we do the morning.
Well, and it's interesting because, AMD stock shot up, right? You saw this, right? And OpenAI has the power, it seems right now, to make announcements, and then the stock market reacts despite you being a private company. How do you think about that part of the equation?
Yeah, look, we don't ever think about things with those types of intentions. I think what we really focus on is like, what can we control? We can control our models, we can control our product, we can control the amount of infrastructure that we invest in. We try and figure out ways that we can be, this kind of conduit for where there's demand for AI with the supply of AI in the world. We think we're dramatically undersupplied relative to the amount of demand out there right now. I think there's probably many multiples of latent demand that have yet to be captured anywhere in the world. And so, I don't pay a lot of attention to the market day to day. I kind of think more on like a 10-year time scale of like, what is the thing that we actually think is going to be true in 10 years? And for us, as Greg and others have alluded to, it's that the world is kind of dramatically rate limited right now by intelligence. And our job is to build intelligence and see what happens after that. So
what do you think is going to be true in 10 years?
I think a lot of the economy will have kind of been rebuilt on these rails that are these kind of AI rails. I think, at the fundamental level, like AI really is these kind of units of intelligence that can be packaged, directed, and configured for productive output, right? Whether that's helping you individually with something or helping an enterprise achieve something, or a startup that is building a new product. I mean, there's like almost in some sense kind of not enough intelligence in the world. And I think the idea that we always had was like, if you could increase the amount of intelligence and make it really cheap, then something dramatically good should happen on the other end. Obviously, we want to be mindful of kind of where there are risks and harms that present, and we try and be really thoughtful about that. But I think on the whole, we're optimists, and we feel like 10 years from now, if there's some increase in the amount of intelligence by as a factor of 1 million, 100 million, 1 billion, something like that, it's going to be a good thing for the world.
One of the things I find really interesting about where you sit is you have a unique vantage point on the market, right? You see how startups, incumbents, developers all interact. What's the state of that landscape right now?
Candidly, I think it's like fragmented. And I spend a lot of time here. It's kind of what I mostly spend my time on right now. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about why that is. And I think a few things are true. So one is we're still really, really early. These things almost have a way of kind of being kind of weirdly chaotic at first, where everyone is trying to kind of build every piece of infrastructure, and it's like, no, use my thing, no, use my thing. And all these kind of intermediate layers start to get built, and you're kind of like, which of these am I using? Which of these is even real? 2 minutes later.
And then there's a layer of something, you're like, why is this here again?
Yeah, like everything kind of gets built and rebuilt, and what's old is new again, and so on. So this is kind of a natural thing for, I think, a technological phase shift when you get this type of thing. I mean, it was true in the early internet, and I think is going to be equally true here. It's just the market trying to organize itself, right? So it's people responding to where they think there's demand. The kind of shape and areas of demand in the world are moving, especially in this world at high pace. And so people are just trying to kind of figure out exactly where they can build. Obviously, you've got the kind of model layer here. You've got the infrastructure layer underneath. Those have some level of consistency, although I would say even by all definitions, those have been frenetic in the way that they've changed over time. And so I think first of all, like eventually that stuff will start to settle, right? There'll start to be common layers, common rails, repeatable solutions that people use to start to build infrastructure and core kind of canonical pieces that need to get built for other things to start to emerge. So that's actually thematically been a big part of what we're trying to do here today through things like the Apps SDK, through Agent Kit, and then obviously all the kind of things that exist in our platform, things like agentic commerce, right, and the agentic commerce protocol. So what we're trying to do is actually build a lot of this kind of middle level infrastructure that make the rules clear for how everyone can build and transact so that the applications can get built and these things can start to become useful. It takes a few years though, so we'll need a little more time.
Well, because the thing I was wondering is because a lot of the narrative right now is around, oh, it's actually easier to build than it ever has been. Like I was actually sitting there thinking maybe I should build myself an agent. I cannot code. I have never, well, I'm actually going to try.
Yeah.
So we'll report back, but it's the sort of thing, does the ease of building create more fragmentation, or do you think over time it's actually going to help consolidate value?
I think it creates kind of more opportunity. And so I would say, it's basically kind of pushing empowerment out to the individual. I think, like, for example, one of the great things that happened coming out of cloud was the dramatic empowerment of like individual software engineers, right? All of a sudden now you didn't need to raise a gigantic amount of venture capital. You didn't need to stand up your own payments infrastructure. You didn't need to stand up your kind of own version of everything. You could just leverage a common, core underlying infrastructure that can be called through APIs. It can be called on demand, paid for on demand. And so the fractionalization of the infrastructure layer is almost in some sense what enabled this kind of like innovation at the top layer. And so I think you're going to see something happen here where you've got a highly fragmented, but what should ultimately come together as a very protocoled kind of infrastructure layer that ultimately enables a lot more building at the top layer. AI thematically, one of the things we see is it's very empowering of people. It's very empowering of individuals. And so whether that's an individual software engineer, just even an individual creative person with an idea, right? Now the time from the thing in your head to the creation of that thing basically gets condensed down to zero. And so you're going to see, I think, this explosion of stuff that gets created. And that's why we say it's like never been a better time to be a builder. And it's true for something like Sora, where it's like you can have a creative idea in your head as it is for an entrepreneur who has an application, in their head that they want to build. Both of those things are true.
Or me, who's dreaming of an email triage
or
agent.
You, yes, we can solve your email inbox situation.
Be careful what you promise. But I believe you. Because the other thing too, amidst this fragmentation, is there is the obvious question of, some parts of this fragmented market are going to fare better than others. I mean, obviously the word bubble comes up. I'm sure you've heard it once or twice. What's your take on AI bubble discourse?
Well, bubbles are kind of a natural part of this. And I think it's somewhat true if you kind of look at the history of it, that bubbles have almost always preceded some important technological shift. The reason for that's actually very rational. It's because there's people recognize what the opportunity is. Capital pours into the space. The landscape is, like we said, highly fragmented, highly chaotic. And so there's not kind of efficient allocation of capital down to every kind of area where, capital could be absorbed. Some valuations, way outstrip the underlying traction of the thing.
So you do think there are valuations out there that are crazy?
I don't have an opinion. It's hard to know. Like, it's very possible that like all this actually is hyper rational. Everything's undervalued by a factor of 10 or something like that. But I suspect that there's like a lot of enthusiasm, and at this point, like, we just try and stay focused on the like thing in front of us. And for everything else kind of in the ecosystem, if people have opinions about it, they're welcome to invest those opinions.
The one of the things that really was a study pinged around the world was that MIT study. Did you see this? 95% of generative AI pilots fail. There are a lot of questions about the methodology around the study, but you can't deny it struck a chord, right? Why do you think it struck a chord, and what's actually going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't pay a lot of attention to studies.
Yeah.
I think it's very easy.
Did you see this though?
I did,
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. I think studies are, it's easy to do a study that says one thing and then do another study that says another thing. We take a very long dated view of this, right? These transformations don't happen overnight. enterprises are gigantic, complex organisms. When we think about how we progress our research roadmap, we actually think along the lines of AIs that are capable of being, impacting in a large organization. That's actually like a benchmark we look at as a kind of a technical thing. We're not there yet. And so we're still very much in this kind of era of you're just now starting to have models that for the first time can use tools, they can take actions, they know how to kind of intelligently solve problems and also kind of like correct their own kind of like lack of problem solving in some sense. But there's still a lot of stuff that has to get built, right? Enterprises have decades of building all this infrastructure that governs access, permissions, identity, security, all of these things that kind of have to come into being to serve software in that environment. And I don't think that there's going to necessarily not be a need for all those things in this world. And in some sense, a lot of those things almost become more complicated, right? So if you've now got meaningful parts of your enterprise offloading work to agents that are running tasks and processes all the time, right? There has to be almost some concept of how do you manage and identify who those agents are and how do you kind of orchestrate them and facilitate transactions between them the way that you and I would in an enterprise talk to each other, engage with each other. So there's almost this entirely new thing that kind of has to get built. And we're like 4 seconds into this entire shift. And so in some sense, going back to the MIT study, I'm like, does it really matter, I guess, kind of what it says? Like we are early enough that I would be surprised if someone was coming out saying that, we've cracked AI in the enterprise.
I was gonna say, because I do feel like some people, they may not say that directly, but they certainly will imply it. And it sounds like part of what you're saying is actually the technology is just getting there. The models are just getting there, that some of this is starting to be possible.
Yeah, that's my view. I mean, I work with enterprises all day. And I think there's still this kind of ingestion process. There's a learning process of what it really means to be able to integrate these things reliably into workflows. And not just have something that's kind of like vaporware that it's like, oh, I shipped a thing and I'm going to call it an agent, but it doesn't really do anything useful. We're talking here about agentic systems that you can actually offload really meaningful amounts of work to. And that shift, I think, is still in process. Now, the stuff that we're announcing here today and other stuff that we have coming out down the line, those types of things will start to become these kind of core pillars and foundational pieces that enable businesses to start to make that transition. And so the kind of same way we said that everything starts as the chaos, it's the 15 cats that are, running around chasing each other that kind of become now, one giant cat that's able to walk in a straight line. That process is underway. And I think you are though starting to see kind of where, if you squint, some of these agents are able to make meaningful impact, right? Codex is a great example. You've now got, software engineering agents that are able to write thousands of lines of code. They're able to go off and solve long-running tasks for hours on end, right? Those dimensions are only going to increase. And so just at least in that one narrow area, it's a glimpse into the future, I think, of what kind of every area could look like. But all that stuff still has to get built.
In terms of enterprise AI adoption, how do you measure ROI? I recognize this is an existential question in a lot of ways, but what do you know to be true about that process?
Yeah, we look at it in a few different ways. And so one is kind of hard to measure, one's easy to measure. The hard to measure thing is actually now what I kind of see as the leading edge of adoption of AI in the enterprise, which is kind of user level adoption. So people, when ChatGPT first came out, it was very clear people wanted to take it to work. So one of the things we were confronted with early on is, well, okay, now we've got a work product kind of by default. And what does it really mean to implement ChatGPT in enterprise and kind of tell the story of what it does? And ironically, one of the things we've always struggled with is kind of what is the ROI story for ChatGPT? Because if you think about it, like we have incredible engagement rates at almost every enterprise we deploy into, like would defy gravity level engagement rates relative to traditional SaaS. And yet no one can perfectly articulate in one line what exactly AI does for the user in the enterprise. And the reason for that is because everyone uses it differently. Everyone's job is a little different. And ChatGPT is a product that kind of, it's like work that fills in around work, right? It's like, I need to write an email, but I don't totally know exactly what the right tone of this is. So let me drop a document into ChatGPT and see if it can kind of model the tone and get the response right. That's not work that would have happened in any other place. It would have kind of happened in your head and you would have kind of fumbled around with that thing for maybe an hour or two, and now it kind of happens in 30 seconds, right? And people, how do you measure that kind of compression of time, right? There's not a good metric for it other than, in theory, people should be and could be spending their time doing more important and more useful things. Same thing in software engineering, same thing in marketing, same thing in sales. And so that's been our challenge, is how do you actually quantify that ROI on the user side? The second one is easier, is on the business process side. So, there you have much more measurable output. So for example, if we go work with an enterprise like T-Mobile, for example, where we've built a lot of tooling around customer support as a critical workflow, we can measure things like response rate, deflection rates, NPS, CSATs, things like that you can actually say, okay, for what the AI can contribute and produce relative to what a human agent could contribute and produce, do these two things kind of roughly come into line? And then the really cool thing about AI is that you can actually take those metrics and then start to use those to basically kind of fine tune the model on the types of things that are good to actually further drive those metrics. And so that kind of
it's a circle almost.
Yeah,
it
that
feeds
kind of,
into it's a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, that kind of real-time learning process for AI to become adaptable and kind of continuously learn on the job is, I think, an important and kind of underexplored paradigm. But for a lot of areas where we deploy in enterprises, it's actually a really important part of how we build.
What's the most common question you get from enterprise customers?
Most common question is, what do we as OpenAI use OpenAI for?
What's the answer?
Well, we use it for a lot of things. We released a blog post that detailed some of this. We use it kind of like I said, almost kind of filling in the work around work, right? So we still use all these kind of canonical systems. Our sales team runs on Salesforce. We are probably the world's most active users of Slack internally at OpenAI. We use kind of all the canonicals like SaaS systems you can think of. These are really, really important systems for OpenAI, and I think they're going to be really, really enduring and important systems, for a while. But one of the things that we're able to do is actually use AI systems to basically help live in the cracks between kind of what the user needs to be able to do with those systems and kind of what those systems represent in terms of a workflow. So if you're a salesperson, for example, and you're trying to prepare for a meeting, right, there's a lot of factors that aggregate into how you think about preparation for that client and that customer. Historically, you've had to go collect all those yourself. You've had to synthesize all the takeaways. You've had to kind of run the analysis, pull the data. You've had to write the profile, hand that off to the other person who needs the context. All that now can be condensed. And so we built a lot of tooling around that for us to be able to actually make our sales teams much more productive and much more efficient. And so, and we hold everyone to that bar. So the way we kind of look at this is there's a team whose job it is to think about how to actually drive output, drive impact in our organization, so that when we have a salesperson and join the team, or a marketer or a software engineer or whoever it is, they really are starting at a higher baseline level of productivity, and they can start to think more along the lines of, hey, instead of managing 5 accounts or 10 accounts, maybe I can manage 20 accounts, right? And that's just incredible leverage in our business.
Now, this is a tough one. There's definitely a perception in the marketplace that OpenAI is the runaway consumer winner in a lot of ways, but that competitors like Anthropic are winning on the enterprise side. Set the record straight for me here. What's going on?
Well, one, I think it's early. And so I think it's hard to declare.
You said, we're 4 seconds into the shift?
Yeah, especially in enterprise. And so, I think it's hard to declare anyone having won anything. 2 is I think this market is gigantic, right? We're talking about, many, many trillions of dollars of total market value here, of enterprise value. And so, I think look, there's going to be a lot of companies that exist and a lot of important companies that build important parts of tooling in the system. And so this kind of is it one, is it the other? I think that's not the correct narrative. I think though, for what I would say is, where we try and build in the enterprise is we try and build, at kind of multiple levels. We try and build really useful models that are kind of generally smart and generally high utility. Those express in products like ChatGPT, where we've seen insane growth for ChatGPT Enterprise, now over 5 million seats for ChatGPT for Work. That's up from 3 million, I think, 2 or 3 months ago. So
2 or 3 months ago, wow. Okay.
Yeah, the rate of growth is crazy. And I think building great tooling for people to take to work is like P0. It's, it's A1 on our list of priorities. As you start to get into the enterprise process, the business process, as you start to think more about verticals, these are areas that are not as tapped in yet, right? And I don't think anyone's quite tapped in here yet. It's because the workflow is more complex, right? There's less opportunity for failure. You need systems that are resilient, that are going to be able to deliver reliably and consistently. Security, permissions, identity, all that stuff starts to matter. So all of that is still, I think, to come. And I think, it'd be premature to declare a winner. Ultimately, though, what I go to work every day and think about is how do I just build the most useful thing for my customers and go from there.
I saw you were a history major. What lessons from the past do you think can help us in understanding AI today?
It's interesting because in some ways, I've learned a lot from kind of having studied previous technological cycles. Like, I think there's some things that rhyme. We talked a little bit about them earlier. And then in many ways, also AI is weird. And the thing that I think makes it the
weird
most...
Weird in a good way? Or weird in a weird way?
Okay.
Okay.
Jinx. The reason I say that is because I think if you look at kind of past technological cycles, there's almost always been kind of one innovation, and then everything kind of through the rest of that cycle has been kind of a sustaining innovation, right? It's been, sometimes people call this a J curve. There's a great book by Carlota Perez that's worth reading that gets into this, that talks about kind of how these types of transformations in history have played out. And it's, at her point, it basically is these actually have played out very consistently. And you can actually understand these things almost as repeatable phenomenon. AI is different because the substrate is in a constant state of evolution. And so if you kind of think about it as this roadmap from kind of where we are to something akin to general intelligence or super intelligence or whatever you want to call it, that path is exponential, but it's also ongoing, right? And so the things that we're doing and using tomorrow are not the same things that we're doing and using today, right? GPT-6 will be a very different model than GPT-5, is a different model than GPT-4, and so on and so forth. And so that creates this, like, almost, it in some sense amplifies, I think, the frenetic nature of the environment. It makes it a great time to be a builder, in my opinion. Like, if you're a startup, I think it's an awesome time to exist, because when the game board is getting shaken up like that,
it's opportunity.
Every day, it's opportunity, right? And so, and I think that, like, anyone that can figure out how to really
thrive
live
in disruption.
Totally, right? And so you can figure out how to live right at that frontier. And really just continue to move with the kind of cresting wave as this continues to go on. I think you're in a great place. And there's been great examples of companies that have done this. I mean, the Cursor team has done an incredible job here, right? And they just found that intersection of the right use of AI and the right product with kind of the right ergonomics. And they've built an amazing product and an amazing company. And so when it works, it really works. And I think that's, exciting. But this is going to be unlike past technological revolutions in that regard.
Well, and this is actually a good segue to the OpenAI Startup Fund. What is it, and what kind of founders are you guys looking for?
Yeah, so the Startup Fund we launched a few years ago, and it was a very simple idea. Basically, it was just a fund to support the companies that were building on our API at the time. This was around, I think this was pre-GPT-4, and so there were a bunch of people who were crazy enough to think they could build companies on GPT-3. And many did.
And you laugh about that because you're like, oh yeah, we love those people.
We do love those people. I had a deep bond with every single one of those founders. And there weren't that many of them early on. But
a genuinely contrarian idea at the time.
Yeah, truly. But the fund was basically, it existed to support that set of founders that, were building with us. And we've had the fortune to, I think, back some of the really most interesting companies that have come through that kind of early cycle. So companies actually like Cursor, like Ambience and healthcare, many others. And it was great for us to be able to see, I think, how people were using the models, create this really, really tight feedback loop and connection with founders that really relied on us every day as a service provider. AI is awesome because, like, in a lot of ways, like, it's a technology that's meant to be co-developed. Like, just building,
it's collaborative by nature from the way you're talking about.
Yeah, like, just building the generalizable kind of base model, like, is, like, fine and it's fun, and GPT-5 is cool, but, like, where it, like, really shines, I think, is when you can take that model and really, like, spin the loop of improvement in a very specific product environment, in a very specific harness, and pointing it at a very specific purpose, where on the surface you're like, there's no way you could get the model to actually, like, do that thing consistently at that level, and then it does. And that's the awesome part, is, like, it feels like magic. And so I think the fund continues to exist. We are really excited about the future of the fund. I think we'll continue to invest a lot into the ecosystem. It's much bigger now. And
I would say, what kind of founders do you look for these days?
Nothing's changed really.
Nothing's changed really. It's the same.
I think like, we just look for people who are really, like, super enthusiastic about AI, and have a, like, very deep command of what it means to kind of, like, build frontier product. I think there's a lot of companies that, like, don't quite get that right. I think there's people who kind of build obvious things that you're like, okay, like, you're a little bit too close to the sun. And so my general advice to founders here, by the way, unsolicited, is, like, try and figure out kind of ways that your company benefits directly from the improvement of the model. That's always been the consistently good signal for us that you've got a real durable company. Is you should be asking us when the next model comes out, because it accelerates you, by a factor of 5, versus companies that are like scared of when the next model comes out. And we look for those companies with the fund.
Now, you have a background in startups. You came from YC. What's the biggest lesson you carry from your time at YC?
Don't bet against the startup ecosystem.
Where did that come from?
Came from YC.
It came from YC.
Yeah.
Do you remember the moment that crystallized for you, or is it just something you've always believed?
I've always believed it. I think it's what attracted me to YC in the first place. I was at a YC company before I was at YC, so I kind of did the full cycle in reverse. I guess I was like at a YC backed company, joined YC, and then left to go join a company that was kind of backed by YC. I guess it wasn't technically, but it was kind of in the umbrella. Yeah. And I think that was kind of the thing that I always thought to be true. I grew up on the East Coast, so I didn't grow up in California, and so this is not my backyard. It's not my home turf.
Did you always want to be in startups?
I always felt like there was something really important happening here, and I always really loved like the idea of like building innovative products. I remember when I was like 11, when the iPod first came out. My parents like wouldn't get me an iPod, and I wanted it so badly, and I like wrote like a whole report for them on like why the iPod is the most important product to ever get built. I still have it somewhere, I think. And then they eventually got me an iPod.
Can you find it?
Yeah, I can try and find it somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've had this like attraction to just like people who want to build new things and figure out better ways of doing things. And that is true at YC, like to an extraordinary degree. Like, it's whatever it was when I was there, almost 400 companies a year, or twice a year. So 800 companies a year that were coming through with everything from like these very like specific ideas where you're like, I care about building better tooling for HVAC companies. And you're like, okay, that seems important. And then you actually talk to those founders and you're like, wait, why are you doing this? And they're like, because HVAC companies are one of the most important subsets of the economy, and they have no tools. They go to work every day and they use clipboards and pens and paper, and they can't operate their business efficiently. And you're like, oh wait, this makes sense. All the way through to like, quantum computing companies or something like that, where you're like, okay, wow, if this works, like this is like you have a significant shot at really changing the world. Obviously there's a ton of science risk in there, so you got to know how to invest that. But, and I think that like spectrum of stuff was just like beautiful. It's like representative of like what our country's about. And I think like, I like wanted to be part of that in some way.
Now, we're basically at time, but I want to ask you one more question.
Yeah.
In the shortest possible terms, one early memory from OpenAI. From around the time you joined.
Yeah. When I first joined, so OpenAI was all researchers. I think I was one of the first kind of non-research people to join the company. And I had worked with OpenAI for a while before I joined the company, but I only really had exposure to like a very small subset of people early on. And so when I first joined, it was the kind of first time I was like showing up to the office and like spending time walking around the halls.
You were the new guy.
I was the new guy. Everyone was like, what does he do? Like, is he doing research? If he doesn't do research, like, what does he do? Comms? And I was sitting at the lunch table, and I like sat down with like a bunch of researchers who were having a like very intense debate about some extremely esoteric topic. And again, with people not knowing exactly who I am, I was sitting there eating my lunch, kind of just listening, trying to take it all in. And then someone like at one point turned to me and was like, what do you think? And I was like, I got a meeting. I think I got to go. And so, but OpenAI actually really early on, this story does not do justice to OpenAI. It was actually like an incredibly intellectually warm place. You could approach anyone and talk about anything, like whatever it was that they were working on. They were happy to explain it to you. People love their work. Like they love the endeavor and the pursuit. And people love trying to kind of like help you understand deeply technical concepts in human terms. And I think it's because, and it sounds sappy, but it's not meant to be, is like, there's like a very like human element to the work that people do. I think people have a consciousness and awareness of like the impact that the thing they're building might have. And so being able to kind of communicate about it, I think is kind of deeply inherent in everyone's like, like disposition at the company. And that's remained true. And I think it's kind of what makes OpenAI special is like, if you want to come there and learn, it's truly the best place on earth.
I've always thought that building AI is actually, in a lot of ways, a deeply human endeavor. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And that was Brad. Now, two things. First, thank you to CJ at OpenAI for magically making my gaming chair appear in San Francisco. The other thing this made me really think about was how I think about these AI startups that are coming to me. Brad, of course, is incentivized to tell a particular story about the state of enterprise AI. That being said, I do think he is right that enterprise AI is still in really early days, and all we actually need to know that that is true is how hard it is to talk about ROI in the enterprise. So I think this is going to change some of my conversations moving forward. And as much as everybody likes to say, oh yeah, we're like in the first inning, part of that is actually true. And there is actually still so much we don't know about how AI is really going to change companies in corporate America. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you soon. Term Sheet is a Fortune Magazine podcast. Our producer-editors are Alana Stev and Allison Rogers. Our executive producer is Lydia Randall. Our production manager is Sam Freund. Fortune's head of video is Adam Bannicky.